This is episode 503 of The Holy Post. On today's show, the feud between Florida's governor and Disney is getting hotter, with new leaked footage of a Disney executive speaking about the company's goals for LGBTQ representation. We talk about both what the right and left are getting wrong in the debate, and why it isn't quite right to see sexual orientation and gender identity as analogous to race. Then there are multiple new studies showing an alarming rise in mental health disorders among teens, but there is some good news for those who are involved in religious communities. Then podcast friend Derwin Gray is back to talk about his new book, How to Heal Our Racial Divide. He talks about how his church is taking the call for racial reconciliation from the seats and into the streets, and why so many church leaders remain so afraid to talk about issues of race and justice. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's get into it. Here is Holy Post episode 503.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. This is Phil Vischer. I am here with Christian Taylor. Hi, Christian.
Hey, Phil.
And Sky Jitani. Hi, Sky.
Hello.
Hi. And Jason Rugg.
Hey there.
Is here on camera for the last time.
Yeah. So I didn't know if we were going to jump right into it or right at the end.
We're jumping right into it. We're jumping right into it because everyone's, they want to know what you're up to.
That's true. I get top billing.
Yeah.
So this is actually my last time appearing on the show in this capacity. I'm going to be stepping back into more of a behind the scenes role, just kind of as things have changed and everything's adjusted. I'm going to be stepping back. I'm still going to be editing the show. I'll be a part of the team. I'm still going to be, cracking jokes on Twitter. But so I just need to kind of focus on some other projects. So I'm not going to be appearing on the Holy Post anymore. But I'll still be on the movie proposal with Sky and Josh. So.
And documentary first.
And documentary first with Christian and Josh.
And the Josh and Jason show with Josh.
No, we haven't figured that out yet.
No,
I guess it would be about like financial stuff if Josh.
Oh,
is
yeah.
So,
Dave Ramsey. You could do a Dave Ramsey thing. Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say, Jason, thank you for your service, for your laugh, for all the years that you've given us. I love having you in the discussion and being a part, but I totally get needing to work on other stuff. So we will miss you.
Thank you, Christian.
We do love having you. We love having you on here, your insights, your giggles and stuff. But to be fair, Jason, your primary contribution has always been behind the scenes, which has been enormous. So we are grateful that that's not changing. The audience might not see that, but
we know it's there.
Connecting every single week to put these shows together. So
we're gonna have to add a laugh track now. It's just not going to be the same. Or we hire someone else who's just a designated laugher. Designated laugher.
Or we just all start thinking that you're really super funny and Sky and I can start laughing more.
Maybe you could laugh at my jokes. Yeah, I guess that's the other solution. Pitch in a little bit, guys.
Yep.
Don't make Jason do everything. Okay, here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Disney. We talked about Disney last week. This is short. I don't want to get into this long. But Disney has gone from bad to worse. I don't know if you've watched what's happened since we talked about Disney last week. The same guy, the guy that kind of weaponized CRT. I forget his name. He tweeted about, here's what we're doing with the term CRT. Or he said it on Fox News, and we're making it so that every negative, crazy thing you think of, you associate with CRT, and now we've ruined that brand. Ha ha ha.
And he also said that it was explicitly to try to undermine public school education and push private school funding.
I missed that altogether.
I didn't hear that part. So anyway, that guy, whose name escapes me, unearthed a behind-the-scenes, actually an internal recording, like a Zoom call recording from a meeting at Disney where they were talking about representation in their kids' stuff. And they said one of the goals was to get much more LGBTQ representation because it has a huge influence on kids. So we want to get a whole lot more LGBTQ stuff in our kids' shows. And then at one point, and this is what everyone is running with, one of the executives in charge of kids programming for, I don't know, Disney Plus or something, said, their goal was to have 50% of the characters either be LGBTQ or racial minorities. And my first thought was, I think they're close on racial minorities. They're probably close to there right now. But everyone else jumped on, wait, you want half of all Disney characters to be LGBTQ? It's like, well, no, that's not exactly what they said. But now that's out and it's spreading like wildfire. And so there's even more calls for boycotts and, Disney hates Christians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Ben Shapiro's company, The Daily Wire, that's already gotten into the movie business, now announced they're going to spend $100 million on conservative children's programming. And they announced that they hired 2 ex-VeggieTales writers to do their first show, which led someone to call my mother actually, and say, I just heard Phil did $100 million deal. Congratulations.
Wow.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Phil didn't do $100 million deal. There's no congratulations. And it's it was writers from the Netflix VeggieTales, not classic veggies or even TBN veggies. So anyway, so Disney is stepping in it, like they stepped in it in one direction, and so they turned around and stepped in it in the opposite direction, and now every time they turn around, it's getting worse.
So here's my question.
Yeah.
A huge company like Disney can't really be successful by only appealing to a small segment of Americans. They
Yeah.
need to be a nationwide admired brand.
They need to be a globally admired brand.
Right, globally admired, but certainly national. We'll take it either way. And so my question is, wouldn't they be more careful about surveying their audience and figuring out what they want, what they don't want, what they will tolerate, what they won't tolerate? And wouldn't that automatically make Disney a more moderating force in the media rather than one that would take up either an extreme left or an extremely right position on this stuff? Am I wrong?
Here's the deal. They've been very, very careful in the past. Bob Iger, the prior longtime, very successful, very well-liked CEO, was pretty open in using his personal leverage against legislation that he found offensive. So, and because Disney has a very large LGBTQ, both fan base and internal corporate population, he was, very supportive of those groups. Bob Chapek came in as the new CEO. He's just not used to being, like, here's what we think about this bill. So he didn't get involved in that at all. He just stayed silent. And it was the contrast between Bob Iger and Bob Chapek that made employees say, you're not supporting us anymore. I thought this company supported us. Now you're not supporting us. That put him in a horrible position. So he did a 180. I'm going to support you a lot. And then, of course, the conservatives, picked that up and said, oh, well, then, forget you. And it just got worse. So Bob Iger, I think, was more successfully diplomatic at applying pressure to the right places to kind of keep most people happy. But the Southern Baptists boycotted Disney back in the 90s because
Right.
so many homosexuals were showing up at the parks and on a given day to have a gay day at Disney. And it wasn't official, but Disney wasn't stopping it. So a lot has changed in 30 years.
Yeah, but again, Disney can't succeed if 30% of Americans think it's an ungodly, unholy, un-American company. So
Yeah.
it isn't about appeasing one side or the other. They need to kind of go down, throw them down the middle here. And that just seems really short-sighted. And why would they?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to put a business hat on here, not a political hat or a theological hat. I'm just trying to think of what makes sense economically for a company like Disney, and for them to be openly bragging about pushing an agenda. And let's face it, like,
Well, that
whatever
was
percentage.
internal. That was internal. It
But
wasn't
even
supposed
that,
to be open.
even internally, that's pretty stupid. So I don't get it. I don't understand why they would think this is an advantageous route to take as a business. So I find the whole thing intriguing. And does this, like Ben Shapiro's company or any other right-wing media outlet creating their own kids and family media stuff, is this just furthering the evidence that we are heading toward
Yes.
some kind of breakdown of the United States where there is this massive cultural and political divide that is inside.
Yeah.
Things like Disney used to unite us, right? We would
Yeah.
go to a Disney movie but now even that is not going to be enough to keep us together.
Christian.
Well, yeah, so I have a question. From the business perspective, like you're saying, Sky, they are a global company and they do have to be aware, I think, of all different, types of people all over the world and, races, religions, creeds, sexualities. That's got to be part of their business plan for sure. But I do think on the Christian consumer side, at least from when I was raising kids, in a strange way, Disney was this safe space, sort of like Veggie Tales, where we could let our kids watch this thing and we could go work on laundry or we could watch together as a family. And in a sense, we sort of equated, at least I did in my mind as a young Christian mom, good content, not necessarily Christian, but good content with Disney. And there wasn't a thought back then necessarily that it was this political company pushing an agenda. So, but now it doesn't seem that way anymore.
No, but it's also been caught up. It's their war with Governor DeSantis in Florida, and he's calling them a woke corporation that's trying to subvert the values of America, and they were trying to stay out of it until their own employees were boycotting, refusing to come to work. So they're in a really tough spot. I don't know where it goes from here. I made a weird prediction like 15 years ago. I think it was in an interview with CT. I don't remember that. Right now, generally Americans from red and blue states can agree on children's programming. That will end the day a same-sex couple moves onto Sesame Street. That was my prediction. Amazingly, 15 years later, there still is no same-sex couple on Sesame Street. So Sesame Workshop has still, I mean, can you only imagine how many times that's come up, in their internal meetings? It's like
Right.
we're not doing representation. So they have still said that's just it's too costly. It's too costly to go in that direction. Disney is under more pressure than Sesame Street apparently, and so this will be interesting to see if we have because I think what Ben Shapiro would like to do is that I'm going to make the equivalent of Fox News for kids, where everyone says
Right.
mainstream media is too liberal, so I'm going to make the alternative, and I'm going to be wildly successful. And it's easier to do that with a news channel than it is with good kids movies, I think.
Can I say something controversial?
Oh no!
What? Go right ahead, Sky.
Oh,
Jump on in.
I think a lot of the assumption coming from the left end of the spectrum here is, and this has been around for a while, but it's the assumption that sexual identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, all of it, that whole package of stuff is all nature, not nurture, right? It's all intrinsic to who a person is when they are born. You are born
Right.
gay, you are born straight, you are whatever. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest some of that to be true. But in the stuff I've read over the last 10 or 15 years, and I'm certainly no scientist, but in my layman's reading of this stuff, what I've discovered is this is incredibly complicated. Human sexuality is very complicated. Human gender identity is very complicated. And while in one person it may well be genetically nature driven, you are inherently gay or straight, whatever it is, for another person it may not be that way. It can be much more complicated. There are differences between male brains and female brains and sexual orientation and the plasticity of these things. And so all that to say, the assumption that if everybody who's born into this world is born gay, straight, trans, whatever they are, then what you do in media really has no effect other than making some people who are born that way feel represented and validated. And if that's the case, then great. Let's have them in our media so they feel validated and represented. However, based on the science I'm reading, if there really is a nurture element to this and that culture and experience does affect some people in the way they understand their self-identity, their sexual orientation, or their gender identity, then having all this representation in the media actually will have an effect on a certain percentage of people in the way they understand their own gender identity or sexuality. And so, I mean, this is why I'm saying it's controversial, because I'm not trying to say either or. It's really both and it's very complicated. But that means that this move on a part of like a Disney to say we want a significant portion of our characters to be sexual minorities, that has some impact on our culture. And it's going to have some impact on some children who are questioning these things. So it's not a matter of just, like in the case of race, of let's have African Americans represented or Asian Americans or Latinos or whatever, because those are immutable qualities. Whereas sexual identity and orientation is a spectrum. Some of it is immutable, some of it is mutable. And that means it's impacted by things like this. And that's where I think some people on the right have legitimate concerns here. But on the left, they want to say, no, it's all immutable. So nothing we do in the media does anything other than make some of these kids feel represented and loved and cared for.
Right.
So that's where it gets really, really messy, and why we have to move beyond the idea that sexual identity and orientation is analogous to race. It's not. It's way more complicated.
Oh, man. Okay, so write your letters to... Yeah, I generally agree with you. I also think from what I've read, it tends to vary a fair amount between the L and the G and the B and the T and the Q, that some are less likely to change what you believe of yourself through your lifetime, and other orientations are more likely, where you'd say, yeah, I kind of thought I was bisexual for, a year. So it's not as clear cut as we would like it to be.
There are people that are born. I mean, you think there are people that are born androgynous. That is a physical fact, right? There's no getting away from that.
Intersex, we call them.
Well, and that's my point. Is it's immensely complicated, and for somebody it can be inherently genetic, and the way someone is born. For someone else, it can be deeply affected by culture, family experience, whatever. So it's massively complicated. And so
but
can't
Sky,
say for
don't you want Winnie the Pooh explaining it to your children?
No, I don't. But I also want there to be some recognition on the part of people who are responsible for creating this media that it's massively complicated, and what you're choosing to do with this representation idea isn't just representation, it's also affecting.
It's also shaping.
It's also shaping, right. And so that's where it's different than race. And we have to have some other way of thinking about this. And as long as it's equated with race, then this is simply a way of validating and affirming people who would be the way they are, regardless of what they experience in the culture and the media. And that's just not the case.
Can I give you a silly example of what you're saying?
Uh-oh.
So when I was in high school, I loved the Go-Go's. I mean, they were the soundtrack to my senior year. And I went to see the Go-Go's documentary not long ago. And I just was aghast when I looked at Belinda Carlisle's hair and her sunglasses and the way she danced. Because that was the way I had my hair as I look back at pictures, the sunglasses I wore, and the way I danced. But I had no idea that what I was doing was emulating her, because somehow I connected with her on a deep level. And so I do think that media is shaping in that way with what we listen to, what we watch, and it does have effect on us, not just in the sexual realm, but in every other way. So that's why as parents, we've always said we want to be careful what our children watch. And I feel like as parents, I think there's got to be a balance for us as well. I don't think that we can say, our children can't watch anything that Disney puts out because, the company itself has, this representation in their films. So I think as parents of children that are consuming media, we need to be thoughtful and discerning about what we let our kids watch, no matter what a company believes.
Dancing like a go-go.
Exactly.
And Christian, you're right. I mean, there was this interesting study I just saw that came out that they paid people who watch Fox News to watch CNN for 30 days, and then they measurably changed their views on many things just from the news they were watching.
Yeah, they were more able to discern untruths after they had watched CNN and Fox News.
Right. So
Interesting.
the point being, like, whether it's the way you dance or the way you dress or the way you vote or the way you think, yes, media shapes that. But the assumption has been that the media you consume cannot affect your sexual identity any more than it can affect the color of your skin. And that's where the analogy breaks down, because sexual identity is massively complicated. And
Hmm.
some of it is very much genetically driven and immutable for some people. But for other people, it's not all immutable and only driven by genetics. It's more complicated. So that's where I just wish there was some acknowledgement on the folks who are creating this media that what they're doing in some way is affecting some people in the way they view themselves and their sexuality and gender. But that's not being acknowledged, because to do that is to somehow be a bigot,
Right.
because you're not equating sexual identity with race as an immutable
Right.
quality.
So I got in trouble last week because I said we were talking about the Florida legislation, the pejoratively named "Don't Say Gay" bill, and I related it to when some people were uncomfortable with segregation. And so some people said, "Oh, so you're saying it's the same as saying, you're a segregationist if you don't want groomers in kindergarten talking about gender." And I tried to correct it, and it kind of spun out of control on Twitter, if you can imagine. Um, and what I was trying to say was, no, no, no. These are two different ideas: race and sexual orientation, gender identity, that are both being, conflated with civil rights, with that immutability. And so, if that's the case, it would be very hard to say we're not going to talk about gender identity until fourth grade, because it would be in the same category legally as we're not going to talk about race until fourth grade. And for most people, that would be entirely unacceptable. No, we're not just going to pretend that different races don't exist. So the question is, do you put those two on the same legal standing? And if we have, then it would be very hard for a bill like that to survive. And that's ultimately what we'll see, is what are the arguments for and against that bill from a legal point of view, and are they similar to what the arguments would have been if it was a legislation about race? Does that make
Right.
Sky,
sense?
can I? Yeah,
Yeah.
can
No.
I? That does make sense, and I think that you're really onto something with that. Sky, I do have a question. Do you think, how in the social dilemma they talked about ethics around social media and there being some responsibility on the part of the companies for how they design it, right? Are you
Hmm.
suggesting sort of the similar thinking behind, these media corporations, that they would have some sort of larger ethical thinking about what their policies and shaping are doing?
Yeah, in general, but I think beyond taking responsibility for the outcome of what they're producing, I think they need to show some understanding to the families, to the parents who are expressing concerns over their young children being exposed to ideas of sexual diversity that they're not ready for. And I don't think those fears are completely ridiculous. Sometimes they can be, but not always. And the reason for that being that sexual orientation and gender identity is, as I keep saying, immensely complicated. And in some people, in some cases, is not an immutable quality. It is
Yeah.
affected by what people experience and see, unlike race, right?
Right.
Your color of your skin, other than, some kind of strange procedures, is not going to change based on the media you watch. So these things are different. And there needs to be a respect on the part of these media companies like a Disney to say, hey, there are some people from certain backgrounds and religious traditions and families or whatever who have concerns about their kids learning about certain things at a certain age, and we want to respect that. For the same reason why, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, Disney has stayed away from indoctrinating kids about religion, because they understand that that's a deeply held belief that
Hmm.
deeply shapes people's lives, and they don't want to be in the business of forming those views because they could contradict that of one's family.
Interesting.
So
That's
they don't go
true.
there. They generally
I
don't
don't
go
know.
there.
I learned how to worship my ancestors from Milan.
But the prevailing assumption on the left is that everything about sexuality and gender is immutable. And therefore, anything we do with those topics are merely meant to represent and validate people who fit those minority identities. And that's equating it with race. And all I'm saying is it's not the same as race because they are not inherently immutable for all people in all places the way race is. And that needs to be handled differently and respected.
So what you're saying is it's more complex and people want to oversimplify it. So
Yes.
when people on the right say, if you want to talk about gender identity in second grade, it's probably because you want to groom children to make them transgender. And on the left, we say, if you don't want us to be able to talk about gender identity in the second grade, it's because you're a bigot and you hate all, non-binary,
Right.
non-conforming people. And both left and right are oversimplifying a complex matter. That no,
And
it does.
misrepresenting it.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
doesn't mean
totally.
you're a bigot if you're not comfortable with that, and it doesn't mean you're a groomer if you think that would be
Right.
valuable.
Right. In fact, I would argue that in taking it from the best case scenario, both the right and the left have very admirable reasons for their positions. On the left, it's we want to care for and represent and validate kids who are non-gender conforming and make them feel loved and welcomed. Amen. On the right, it's we understand that for some young kids, gender confusion can lead to greater anxiety and distress in a way that doesn't exist if they're not introduced to that idea at a young age. And we want to protect them from unnecessary anxiety and stress that a second grader isn't ready for. And we want to introduce them to these ideas when we believe as a parents are ready. That's also a compassionate. So they're both coming at it from compassionate
Right.
motives,
Right.
but they're for political and cultural reasons being misrepresented in order to demonize the other side to score political points, which is just sad.
Right. Okay. I'm moving on. I got bad news and I got good news. Okay. Bad news.
Give me the bad news first.
That was my plan. I sensed that's what you wanted. And so I already planned it that way. The CDC warns of a steep decline in teen mental health. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is warning of an accelerating mental health crisis among adolescents, with more than 4 in 10 teens reporting that they feel persistently sad or hopeless, and 1 in 5 saying they've contemplated suicide. The findings drew on a survey of a nationally representative sample of 7,700 teens conducted in the first 6 months of 2021 when they were in the midst of their first full pandemic school year. The survey results underscored the vulnerability of certain students, including LGBTQ youth and students who reported being treated unfairly because of their race. And female students are far worse off than their male peers. In October, the American Academy of Pediatrics declared a national emergency in child and adolescent mental health, saying that its members were caring for young people with soaring rates of depression, anxiety, trauma, loneliness, and suicidality that will have lasting impacts on them, their families, and their communities. So part of this is pandemic related, that everything's been turned upside down for these kids, that, the community that they were getting from schools and other activities, sports activities, were all shut down suddenly. They were stuck home alone. Part of it was already a trend before then, though. There's just an increase in mental health issues and depression. Nearly 30% of the teens surveyed said a parent or other adult in their home lost their job during the pandemic. And a quarter of those surveyed said that they were struggling with hunger. They were going without meals. So, nearly half of gay, lesbian, and bisexual teens said they'd contemplated suicide during the pandemic, compared with only 14% of heterosexual peers. And girls were twice as likely to report poor mental health. More than 1 in 4 girls reported they had seriously contemplated suicide during the pandemic, twice as high as boys. They also reported higher rates of drinking and tobacco use than boys. And then this is where we get into a little of the community aspect. The survey also revealed that students who felt connected at school fared far better than those who did not. Teens who said they felt close to people at school were far less likely to report suicidal thinking, and they were far less likely to report poor mental health than those who did not feel connected. The same held true for teens who felt connected virtually to friends, family members, and clubs. So if you had community, you were much, much more likely to be doing well. So part of this is a story about mental health issues. Part of it is a story about the breakdown of community and community involvement.
When I read the article, the part that struck me was that the article, I don't think, said anything about social media.
Hmm.
Nothing.
No, that's not a thing. That
Well, and I
doesn't
don't think
do anything.
those two could be separated because during the pandemic, the social media was the only connection really, and everybody was online doing school and stuff like that. So I don't think there's any way you can separate the two, honestly, or
Yeah, but
not
I
include
mean,
it.
it acknowledges that the upswing in teen mental health disorders predates the pandemic.
Yeah.
It was certainly exacerbated by the pandemic and all the stuff that they relate to with parental unemployment and being disconnected from community and all that stuff certainly is true. But I was just I'm surprised by that, and I'm surprised that they didn't go deeper into why this seems to be a greater problem among teen girls than teen boys.
No.
And I've read other
Right.
reports that say that social media is far more detrimental to teen girls and boys, particularly because girls are more social
Yeah.
and feel the stresses of social media, the expectations, the body image, expectations,
Yeah. And the expectations for
bullying and everything. Yeah.
the visual expectations for girls on social media are very
Right.
different than the visual expectations for guys on social
But
media.
for this report to just ignore the social media component because
Right.
it's not pandemic specific, I thought was like, the pandemic specific stuff is going to resolve itself, God willing, right? It's going to go away in the next number of months. Hopefully in most places it already has. But the social media stuff isn't going anywhere. That's here to stay.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm going, why aren't we talking about this more?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here's the good news. Now, ready for some good news?
Yeah, that was really sad. I hope this is really happy.
That's not good news. American men are dropping out of college in alarming numbers. Okay, that itself
That's
is
sad too.
that's not good news. A slew of articles over the past year depict a generation of men who feel lost, detached, and lacking in male role models. The sense of despair is especially acute among working class men, fewer than 1 in 5 of whom complete college. Yet one group is defying the odds: boys from working class families who grow up religious. What religion offers teenagers varies by social class. Those raised by professional class parents, for example, do not derive as much benefit in terms of educational advantage from being religious. But teenage boys from working class families, regardless of race, who were regularly involved in their church and strongly believed in God, were twice as likely to earn bachelor's degrees as moderately religious or non-religious boys. Religious kids are not any smarter. They do better in school, though, because of how religious belief and religious involvement can buffer working class Americans from despair. So
Interesting.
this study of thousands of working class boys shows that they gain confidence and social capital from being involved in religion. And that shows up in how they do at school, and it shows up in their performance for the rest of their life. Okay, another study, similar, hold that thought, Sky. People who consider themselves more accountable to a God report higher levels of 3 of the 4 variables of psychological well-being. The association is stronger in people who pray more often, suggesting accountability accompanied with prayer enhances psychological well-being for believers. So, if you believe, and they said this was a Baylor study done together with a couple other colleges. They focus on what the authors call theistic accountability. Embracing accountability to God in a virtuous manner is distinct from merely conforming to the social norms of your religious group. So you're not trying to be good just because of peer pressure or social pressure. You're being good because you feel like there is a higher being and a higher calling from a higher being, and you're trying to live up to that. So that's associated with 3 very positive mental health outcomes. So, kids are struggling, and we actually have some good news that involvement in church helps on like a bunch of different metrics, from educational to well-being to less likely to be depressed. There's good news.
Yeah.
That is good.
Can I add a little caveat to this though?
Oh no,
Goodness.
to my bad news to make it
No,
not
no,
as
no.
bad, or to my good news to make it
the
not as good.
No, it's not. It doesn't make it
Don't
as
do
good. I
that,
just because
Sky.
some people might take that information and go, "See, Christianity makes people better," and the research, though, was not strictly around. It had nothing to do with theology. It
No,
didn't
it's
look
not
at.
about theology.
It didn't look at what the churches are teaching. It doesn't look at whether this is actual biblical Christianity or some, Looney Tune version of it. And it also equated similar outcomes for people who are part of non-Christian religious communities, like synagogues. So it's
Yes,
it's a
higher.
general
Yes.
it's a general positive impact of religious communities, not anything that's uniquely specific to following the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yes, though the study of education results for young boys was specifically Christian denominations because they didn't have enough data for other religions in the U.S.
Right. But even within that category, there's a lot of diversity of theological belief. Like, are you talking
Yes.
Roman Catholic? Are you talking Latter-day Saints? Are you talking Pentecostal? Are you talking prosperity gospel? So that you can't take this data and go, good Bible teaching is the difference.
No, it is not about how you preach.
Right.
It's about getting kids into a community, and particularly a community. Here's a quote from the study on young boys. Theological belief on its own is not enough to influence how children behave. Adolescents must believe and belong to be buffered against emotional, cognitive, or behavioral despair. The study found that religion offers something that other extracurricular activities such as sports can't. It prompts kids to behave in extremely conscientious and cooperative ways because they believe that God is both encouraging them and evaluating them. So, and this is the education study. The other study was, what if you feel accountable to God? So this is talking about accountability to God within a whole different study.
So, so get involved in religion somewhere, even if it's a completely pagan thing, because
No, don't say
it'll
that,
benefit
Sky.
your life. Isn't that
Sky.
what we're saying?
Sky, take it back. Take it back.
Okay. I wonder if part of the benefit here, I mean, it's what they say, the sense of purpose and meaning and a buffer against despair. Was that the language they use?
Yeah.
But I wonder if part of it is also that traditionally religions have taught people to delay gratification and to work toward future goals, right? Which is really a basic quality of a flourishing adulthood, is the ability to delay gratification and work toward the future, which is exactly what going to college or being successful in a career or any of that stuff requires. And I wonder if without a larger community that's reinforcing that delay of gratification, it's just that much harder to develop that quality.
Yeah.
Especially for boys.
Christian, what do you think? You had boys. You had boys once.
I did have boys. Actually, I have 4 of them. And, going back to what you were talking about in regard to the pandemic, I mean, I watched 3 of my boys lose their graduations. 2 of them lose their sports seasons. They're sitting at home for 6 months. They're not seeing people. They're on their phones or just, watching TikTok. There was loneliness there. And I think that was mitigated by being in our family. We were all kind of stuck together for 6 months, and that was a blessing. But I also have, we are a family that talks about accountability to God, and that God is, involved in our lives, cares about us, loves us, and, we can seek him for direction in our lives. And I think you're right. There is that delayed gratification, Sky. But I also do think, if you believe that there is somebody involved in your life that loves you and that cares about your future, and you're with other people that believe the same, you are thinking outside of yourself, and you're digging into deep roots of, where your identity lies, where your community lies. And there's no question that I think those can be a boon for, the way that you feel about things and life and decisions that you make. And so I think there's a lot of benefits there from, being in a community like that.
Right.
Is it another way of saying that it takes a village? Only what we're saying is it takes a church, it takes a community of.
Can we say that and not be leftist? Yeah. So, Sky, here's a question though, because we talk a lot about where churches are kind of falling down or becoming less beneficial, less relevant? I'm not sure even how you'd phrase it. What do you think churches can do with this in mind of, helping kids to find community? And it's more because in one of these studies, they said that parents, especially affluent parents, when asked, will say, "My kids get more benefit from their sports leagues than from church." And they're saying, actually, this study kind of calls that into question, because there are things that they, do not get from sports that they
Yeah.
would get from church that are psychologically beneficial.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction. I think there are a lot of great benefits kids get from being involved in sports, including self-discipline and delayed gratification and working towards a
Teamwork.
goal, teamwork. I mean, great things. I'm not against that at all.
Trying to
But
please a higher power.
right, trying to please a
That's
higher
true
power.
too.
Um, but there are things that religion carries with it that sports doesn't get near, which is that metaphysical sense of meaning and purpose and hope that goes way beyond whether or not you made it to the playoffs in
Right.
your season. So that's really, really beneficial. The other thing I would point to is much more detailed research and data that's come from our friend Kara Powell at the Fuller Youth Institute. And she's been writing books, and her team's been doing work on this for many, many years, and has found that one of the most important things for young people in the church isn't just that they're there or that they're involved in a youth group or something, but it's how many adults in the community know them by name.
Right. Right.
So when a kid walks into the church foyer or into some church event, a potluck or whatever, are they only known by their peers, by the other teenagers that are there, or maybe the youth pastor? Or are there other adults who can go up to that kid and ask, "Hey, how was your baseball game?" Or how did that concert go? Or what's up with you and your girlfriend? Or how's you're studying, going for your ACTs or whatever it might be. And if more adults know that kid by name, then they are more likely to integrate the faith community as part of their own identity because they feel like they matter and they're a part of it.
Right.
So a takeaway for me is not just, hey, let's have great programming for teenagers, but what can we do to integrate more cross-generational engagement with teenagers so that they feel the love and care of that community, which is a way of feeling God's love and care.
Exactly.
To the point, one of the articles said that teens need to belong, not just believe. And that belonging piece comes through those intergenerational connections.
Yeah.
Well, and as the church, we're supposed to be the hands and feet of Jesus. And so if we are in a community loving those, right around us like Christ would have us, that benefit is going to be felt by everybody in the community, just, not just teens. So, yeah, I agree.
Right. So how do we try to shape, Christian culture, Christian society to involve kids more intergenerationally, without just creating all the programs that we used to have where, you don't get to have any high school friends, you only have church friends, and you don't get to do any of the high school stuff, you only do the church stuff. There's got to be a way to present the religious life of a Christian, as less of a subculture, I guess, and more of, this shapes your entire life, not just how you spend your time.
Yeah, I'm a little biased here because I've gotten more involved with, and I have a lot of friends who are deeply involved with Young Life.
Yeah.
But the philosophy that Young Life has taken from its origins is you go to where the kids are. And
Mm-hmm.
so rather than inviting a kid into the youth group, it's, well, as an adult, why don't you go hang out where they are, at the football games or the coffee shop or wherever they're doing something. And I think that it's just so Jesus-like to me.
Mm-hmm.
That as adults in the church community, do we care enough about these young people that we will show interest and take time and effort to engage them on their terms in their turf?
Right.
And validate and encourage them and come alongside them and bless them and not just say, you need to come into my building at my time when it's convenient for me to be the program, part of the program that I created. And then only in those conditions are met will you be validated as a part of my community. And so I think we got to think beyond that. And there's ministries that do that better than others.
Well, and I will say too, I've been part of this small home church thing recently in the past 6 months or so. And it's really interesting because in this home church, there are high schoolers, there are little children, there are middle-aged adults, and there are older people. And because it is so small, it is easy for us all to sort of talk to each other, interact with each other, and get to know each other on a more personal level. And I think you do have to scale it down in order to really get to know people in general anyway. So at least, I mean, this is just anecdotal in my own life, but I do think it helps build relationships when things are smaller.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've kind of argued for decades that you got to scale it up so you can offer more programs. And some are starting to argue you got to scale it down so you can offer more relationships. 'Cause
Yeah.
the relationships might take you further than the programs. Or the worship band, the hot worship band. Okay, let us know what you think. Show up on holypost.com. Thanks for listening in. We got a good guest. We got a good guest. I know who it is, but I can't remember right now, but it's a good guest. So you're really going to enjoy this. So hang out for the for the interview, and we will see y'all next week. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Derwin Gray is no stranger to the Holy Post. I believe this is now his 4th appearance on our podcast, and I'm thrilled to have him back. I always have great conversations with him, and this one is no exception. He's here to talk about his new book, How to Heal Our Racial Divide, what the Bible says and the first Christians knew about racial reconciliation. You might recall that he was on in the past to talk about how his church, Transformation Church near Charlotte, North Carolina, is really committed to racial reconciliation and the theology that undergirds that commitment. But in this new book, he takes it beyond just the local church and looks at what does it mean to carry that vision out into the world and into our society. In Derwin's view, that's what it means for us to love our neighbors as ourselves. One of the more interesting parts of this conversation that I hope you pay attention to is how he diagnoses why so many churches and church leaders don't carry this vision, why they're so reluctant to talk about race, and what's preventing us from being this positive influence in our country that really desperately needs it right now. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Derwin Gray. I hope you find it challenging, and I hope you pick up his book, because it is one of the wiser, more pastoral and theologically rooted engagements of this topic that I think is accessible to most people and certainly most church leaders. Here's my conversation with Derwin Gray. Derwin Gray, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Thank you, Sky. It's always good to be with my brother that I have a bromance with. I just want the world to know I have a bromance with Sky Jatani.
Well, I think you've made that pretty clear, but I welcome it, and I think it's mutual. Normally, I would begin by saying something like, congratulations on the new book, but I don't want to say that because part of me grieves that this book was even necessary.
Yeah.
So talk about why it's called How to Heal Our Racial Divide. You've written about race in other contexts. You wrote this phenomenal book that you talked about on our show before called Building a Multiethnic Church. Why did you feel this one was necessary right now?
You know, the way I write books is it's not something I really want to do. There's a burning and a stirring in my heart and in my bones that I have to get out. And so I agree with you. It's disheartening that we have to write a book about something that is so central to the message of King Jesus, his kingdom, and his beautiful gospel. But I wrote How to Heal Our Racial Divide because I'm just tired, specifically, of followers of Jesus being more of the problem instead of being the solution to the problem. Paul says that we are ambassadors of reconciliation. Jesus and his kingdom has broken into earth, and a part of that breaking is this good news that we can be vertically reconciled to God and horizontally reconciled to each other. And so I wrote this book because I'm tired. I wrote this book as a manifesto. I wrote this book so that God's people can grow in our theological imagination and our love for Jesus and our love for each other.
Okay, so we're going to put in the show notes a link to our previous conversation about your book, Building the Multiethnic Church, because there's some overlap, especially in the early chapters of this book, with what you did at Transformation Church and some of the theology there and stuff. But can you tell the story? Early in the book, you tell the story about speaking to a group of church planting leaders in some denominational meeting about your story at Transformation Church and the value and theology of a multi-ethnic church. Tell the story of how they reacted. to
Yeah,
that
so
message?
so I was in a room with church planners who were white brothers, and the district superintendent was a Puerto Rican guy, and so he was asking us to share why our churches are the way we are. What is the vision of the church? And I said, well, Jesus has the greatest vision ever. In essence, it's to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbors, you love yourself, and then to go make disciples of every ethnos, which is every ethnic group. And so, therefore, we wanted to reach every person within our area at Transformation Church. So, therefore, with this good news of King Jesus, we wanted to build a community that reflected our community, which was multi ethnic and multi generational. It's rooted in the gospel. Like God made a covenant with Abraham that he's going to give him a family, and Jesus comes to give him this blood-bought, redeemed family. And so after I shared why we were a multi-ethnic church, rooted in theology, rooted in the gospel, it was just silence. And then the pastors began one by one to not come at me with scripture of why I was wrong, but they more told anecdotal stories. And so at that point, I'm going, there's nothing gospel, there's nothing biblical about what you're saying. A lot of it was fear-based. What would white men do at their church? Would they leave? Would they be criticized for talking about race? And so I knew at that point that if I continued the conversation, I would be perceived as the angry black man. And so whenever people can't keep up with you theologically, they go to ad hominem attacks. And so I've known enough. So I just sat back and started to pray. And the Puerto Rican district superintendent just said, brothers, what Derwin is saying is right. It is New Testament, and it is the future of the church. And it was like you could hear just a pin drop. And all these years later, multiple of those pastors have actually reached out to me to help them in how to cultivate a multi-ethnic church that heals the racial divide through the gospel. So there was some vindication, but there was a lot of pain to get to the vindication. And I've seen that a lot over the last 15 years.
So as you look back on that moment with that room of white church planters, how would you diagnose their resistance? What was it that was preventing them from embracing what you and I would both argue is a plainly obvious mandate of the New Testament?
Yeah. So what I would say is, by way of a biblical story, is I think it's fear of criticism. When you look at Peter in Antioch, Peter's eating with the Gentiles. In Acts chapter 10, he went into Cornelius's house, a Gentile, and gave this incredible speech about God not showing favoritism to any ethnic group. But yet, in Antioch, this beautiful gospel-centered multi-ethnic church, in Galatians chapter 2, when the party of James comes, it says that he pulled away from the Gentiles because he was afraid of their criticism. The Apostle Paul says, Peter, you're walking out of step with the gospel. So we know that ethnic harmony, racial justice is intrinsic to the gospel, that we are brothers and sisters in Christ. And so just as Peter was afraid of the good old boys from Jerusalem, there are a lot of my white pastor brothers who are afraid of people in the congregation that give. They're afraid of being criticized. They are afraid. After George Floyd, several of my pastor friends preached messages on racial reconciliation and racial justice through the gospel, and thousands of people left their churches. One of my pastor friends had $1 million walk out of the door in 6 months. And so there's this legitimate fear. So that's number one. Number two is it's an underdeveloped view of what the gospel actually is. Many people say, well, the gospel is Jesus died for my sins and he rose again. Well, that's true, but that's not all the trueness of the story. The Apostle Paul says in Galatians 3:8, the gospel was preached beforehand to Abraham in this, that all the nations would be blessed. The good news is there's a good father who is purchasing a people of every nation, tribe, and tongue to be justified, to be redeemed, to be family, to image forth his glory on the earth. The idea that I can love God and be indifferent towards my neighbor of another ethnicity is foreign to the New Testament. The goal of redemption is to conform us to the image of Christ, which is the image of love. And the devil has done such a great job of distracting us. And it's not just America, but around the world,
Yeah,
historically.
you have this great quote from John Perkins. He says, "The problem is that there is a gaping hole in our gospel. We have preached a gospel that leaves us believing that we can be reconciled to God, but not reconciled to our Christian brothers and sisters who don't look like us, brothers and sisters with whom we are, in fact, one blood." Um, we've talked about this on the show in the past, sort of the individualization of the gospel, the way we've lost the horizontal dimensions of it all. But let me back up a second, though, to go to that fear thing that you
Yeah.
began with, because earlier in the book, you do a great job. You outline that story of Peter, fearing the good old boys coming in from Jerusalem, but you also outline how there's this pattern, and we see it both in the New Testament and then in church history, of when the Spirit moves, there is the creation of a multi-ethnic communion around Christ.
Yeah.
And you see that on Pentecost, you see that in these other churches that were planted in the New Testament. And then invariably fear comes into that system and wants to break up that multi-ethnic community into mono-ethnic communities. And you mentioned the Azusa Street revival in 1906, this movement
Yeah.
of the Spirit in the early 20th century, and how multi-ethnic it was from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And then it didn't take long before the cultural values of white supremacy and segregation and everything else came into that movement of the Spirit. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, we just talked about this not long ago on our show, how in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was all this racial reconciliation movement that was going on in different parts of especially white evangelicalism. And that has just been shut down, like, completely. So apart from the personal fears that a church leader might have about money walking out the door or criticism, what do you think are the larger kind of cultural fears that are preventing us in the church today from pursuing this? Forget from pastors and preachers, but just ordinary people in the church. What are we so afraid of right now that's preventing us from engaging on this level?
Yeah. So I think number one, for many Christians, we have bought into this idea, and specifically for my white Christian brothers and sisters, we've bought into this idea that somehow Jesus is wrapped with an American flag. And if you criticize the atrocities that America has committed, and America, like all nations, has done some beautiful and great things and will continue to do so. I love my country. But when you begin to idolize your country, a criticism to bring out an area of injustice becomes a personal attack. And so, what I think is, for many white brothers and sisters, somehow the devil has deceived them to thinking that, well, I am America. And I just want to pause here. My great, great, great grandfather, Moses Davis, fought in the Civil War for Virginia against the Confederacy. The
Hmm.
Confederacy was a 4-year movement that basically said, we don't want to be a part of this experiment called America, the Union. We want to keep people enslaved. Within my blood is patriotism that was willing to lay down their life for what the American flag stands for: liberty and justice for all, not for some, but for all. I believe that that is a Christian value. It's not the gospel, but it's a Christian value: liberty and justice for all. Within my blood is patriotism. Much of this country was built on the labor of enslaved people. So, therefore, it's very important to understand that for all of us, white, black, whatever, but to my white brothers and sisters, your identity is not in America. Your identity is in King Jesus. Long after America is gone, the kingdom of God will remain. The gates of hell will not prevail against the kingdom. Not doesn't say against America. America is awesome. Love it. But it's not the kingdom of God. And so that's the first thing. Secondly, there's a fear of losing power, a fear of losing control. How do you tell a fish that it lives in water? Well, it has to be caught and get outside of the water to go, oh, wow, there's something else around the world. So a lot of times for white people in general, white Christians also, is there's this normalization that, well, yeah, we should be the center of it all. And the reality is, Paul says this is gospel. Paul says this: do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but consider others better than yourselves. Do not only look out for your own interests, but look out for the interests of others. Uh, Gospel living is self-giving. Gospel living is sacrificial. Gospel living is considering the plight of the other. And so an individualized gospel plus demonic influence plus this idolization of America has reduced the gospel to a individualized source of keeping power versus understanding, no, we are the body of Christ. And 1 Corinthians 12 says that if any part of the body's hurting, we are all hurting because we are literally the body of Christ. So what I'm trying to do, Sky, a lot like you, is I want to press people deeper into the story of God, deeper into the gospel, deeper into discipleship. Every single letter that the Apostle Paul wrote was, how do Jews and Gentiles, this new multi-ethnic family that used to be enemies, become one and live out of that oneness? That our discipleship cannot be destoried from racial reconciliation through the gospel. It's within that story.
Okay, so here's how I'm thinking about these things. I am putting Christian communities into kind of three buckets. So one bucket are those churches that say all this stuff, race, blah, 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 has nothing to do with the gospel. We don't need to talk about it. We don't need to deal with it. And they are just oblivious. They're preaching a hyper individualized message that's just about personal salvation, and they stay away from anything else. And you've talked eloquently and convincingly about the problem with that model. The second bucket are churches that are doing what you're saying, right? They understand the horizontal and vertical dimensions of the gospel, the reconciliation we have in Christ. They understand the Jew-Gentile multi-ethnic reality, and they're pursuing this in their Christian communities. And they're all in there. They're talking about it, they're engaging it. But they would argue that's as far as it goes. Like, this is a calling for within the Christian community, and we have no responsibility to take this outside into the world. We have a responsibility to win people with the gospel and welcome them into fellowship with us and into that multi-ethnic reality, but we're not responsible for the broken, unjust systems of the world. We just need to keep it here in the church. I'm hearing a lot from those two categories. I'm not hearing much from the third category, which is Christian communities or churches that are talking about it, they're preaching everything, and they feel they have some responsibility to extend this healing out into the world and the systems, even among non-believers. So talk about that. What responsibility do you as a gospel minister and do Christian communities that are doing this have for the world outside the walls of the church?
So what I would say this is, what happens in the seats should spill over into the streets. And so the idea that what happens in the local church doesn't scatter into every facet of society to bring about reconciliation and healing is not the gospel. The good news is, what we do as Christians should be good for the world. And so what I would say to the people in bucket number 2, I would really be curious if you're actually living out the gospel, and do you have more different colors in a congregation, but does the colors actually color your congregation to be crayons out into the world to say, no, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, to quote Dr. King. And so we as the people of God should let our light so shine that it brings glory to our Father in heaven. And so, therefore, we should be in every facet of society promoting goodwill towards all men. And it just comes towards this: love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so love is the highest value. So we at Transformation Church, and what I'm trying to write about and how to heal our divide is that third bucket, which I would say is the true bucket, that what happens in the seats should spill over into the streets. And we have people at Transformation Church who are doing racial reconciliation at their secular jobs. Like they're taking it into their schools. This should influence everything that we do to be the hands and feet of Jesus, his ministry, his mission on earth.
So, what do you say to the person, the critic, who says, Derwin, but what's the point of trying to fix broken, unjust, racist systems if people aren't coming to faith in Jesus? Shouldn't we just be going out in the world and preaching the gospel? And if they come into faith in Jesus, then we can deal with this racism stuff. But going and fixing systems with unregenerate people, that's a waste of time.
Well, what I would do is I would take a step back and say, why do you think on 121 or 1621 the US Capitol was stormed? Because there were people, primarily white people, who thought that there were unjust systems and they wanted to make an impact with it. And many of them said they belonged to Jesus, right? So typically, people who say, don't worry about unjust systems are the people who benefit from the unjust systems. So let me just give you an example. We have white brothers and sisters who have adopted Black kids, and particularly Black boys. When they're young, they're cute, they're cuddly, but about 15, 16, 17, they go from cute and cuddly to, oh my gosh, I see them as a threat. And I've had personally white people who've adopted Black sons come and say, Pastor, I just can't believe the racism. I just, the way my biological kids who are white are treated versus my adopted son who's Black is treated. I just can't believe this. And I just lovingly say, why are you having trouble believing it? We have been telling you this
Right.
for generations. Well, the reason why you believe it now is because the problem has walked into your home. It's knocked on your front door. The problem is now yours. And so, as Christians, to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, a part of loving your neighbor is your burden, your problem is my burden and my problem, because I'm to be a foretaste of the new heaven and new earth where shalom, God's peace, rules and reign. Don't wait until a problem knocks on your door for you to care. So can you imagine in the council of the Trinity in eternity, and the Father, Son, and Spirit is like, okay, our creation, our image bearers are just going to blow up and we're going to redeem them. And Jesus goes, I ain't going because I'm holy. I have no sin. That's not my problem. So I'm not going to solve the problem. No, the love of God says it's not my problem, but I'm going to be the solution to the problem.
Yeah.
And we are a cruciform people that we should care about unjust systems. But most people don't think the systems are unjust because they haven't experienced the noose around their necks. And so what the power of a true multi-ethnic church is when we live in close proximity, we begin to love each other, we begin to care for each other, and all of a sudden we go, oh my gosh, the way you're being treated is wrong. It is wrong that so many people are incarcerated and they're innocent. The only reason they're incarcerated is because they could not afford to pay for good attorneys. You know, and so I'm trying not to throw shade here, but I want to give an example. How can an NFL owner, my former job, an NFL owner get caught on video in a massage parlor breaking the law, indecent acts, sexual acts, but he gets off and these Asian women are deported and criminalized? It's because money talks and blank, blank, blank walks.
Yeah.
And so that's unjust. And when we look at public schools, when there's so many areas that this bleeds over into, one of the beautiful blessings of racial reconciliation is that the gospel begins to expand your heart to love people in a way that their problems and their burdens become yours. And that's a picture of Jesus.
To that end, there's this moment in your book that made me laugh out loud, and I want to quote it. You said you were talking with a white brother who's a Christian, and you asked him how he felt about black people, and he said, "I don't have a problem with them." And you you replied, "I asked him to show me in Scripture where Jesus says, 'Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and do not have a problem with your neighbor.'"
Yeah.
Like that's kind of, but that speaks to that posture that a lot of people have of, I don't have a problem with them. They don't have a problem with me. It's not my issue. I'm not involved. Rather than,
Hmm.
I'm called to actively love my neighbor. And if my neighbor is
Hmm.
hurting, if my neighbor is experiencing injustice, the gospel and the Spirit of God compels me to engage and seek a
Hmm.
remedy. Um, okay, to put some flesh on that and some example
Hmm.
on that, talk about the partnership that you've created between Transformation Church and the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department, and how that partnership was leveraged in the wake of the George Floyd murder.
Yeah, yeah. So I I grew up in the hood. I grew up where there was fear of the police. Some of it was warranted, some of it was not. But we know historically there have been some incredibly deep hurts between communities of color, i.e., Black people, and the police. So when we founded Transformation Church, our big thing was this: if our community doesn't change, then we shouldn't be here, because Jesus is a God of resurrection. He makes dead things live, and so I wanted to be a bridge between the church, the Black community, uh, and police, because we have a lot of godly, awesome police officers, male and female, that are part of our church. You can be pro police and pro police reform. So way back, even before. Um, like it was right after Trayvon Martin, like even before everything jumped off, we've had a long-standing relationship with the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department. And so I brought in former Chief Putney to talk to our congregation. He's a Black police officer who rose up the ranks to become the chief. And so I wanted his perspective. He shared the good, he shared the bad, he shared the ugly. And he's like, listen, we can have all the training we want to, but if there are people with racist hearts, they're going to use that. If there are people who have biases, they're going to use that as much as we try to train. He did have some very, very positive things. But what we did after George Floyd is I did an IG live with Chief Putney, which people can see on my Instagram account, to really talk through these issues. We have to have incredible conversations. But one of the things that we did too as well is I had a young African American man as a part of our church who protested a police shooting in Charlotte. An African American judge who used to play in the NFL, and a white police captain. And we had a gospel conversation from all three of those perspectives. And so the white police captain, like, I trust that man with my life. Like, he is a good man. The judge, I trust him. The young man, I trust him. And so we can all come at a problem from different angles. It's when we demonize the other side where demons get in and divide. And so having these conversations to say, listen, I am pro police and pro police reform. The problem comes in when there are people who say, well, the police are the authority, and in essence, there's no problem. Well, as a Christian, you're denying total depravity. We're all messed up, and you're denying demonic powers and authorities. Romans 6:10. So the police department surely didn't get skipped by total depravity and demonic powers. There's something about the culture that says, well, listen to authority. Well, it's because that authority has benefited you. I
Right.
remember one year I was in Montana, Sky, with my family, and I seen a white man arguing with a police officer. I mean, he had his finger in his face and arguing with a police officer. I said to my wife, Vicky, you see that? That white man's arguing with that police officer. Boy, if I would have tried that, I would have been under the jail.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so talk about the effect that those conversations have had on people in your church? Because I'm imagining if your church is like anything like the churches I've been a part of, people tend to marinate in their social media and cable news stuff, and they only get one side, or everything's presented to them as a dichotomy, a polarity
Yeah.
between you're pro police or anti police, or you're pro BLM or you're anti BLM. And here you are modeling and demonstrating a more nuanced, gospel centered, complicated vision of it. How did people respond to that when what they're hearing from you and folks in your church doesn't conform to the messaging they're getting in the media?
Overwhelmingly, the response has been very good. And here's why, Sky. We launched in 2010. My messaging has not changed despite our culture. And so a lot of our people were already prepared. A lot of our people already knew, but yet and still, you still had. I've gotten emails from white brothers and sisters say I shouldn't feel ashamed when I come to church, and I'm like, if you're white, you should not be ashamed of past sins in America. Now, you need to acknowledge you benefited from that, but
Mm-hmm.
there's no need to be ashamed unless there's an idol there that's being exposed. I've had black Christians at our church say, "Listen, you need to be harder on the white people." I'm like, "Where's that in the Bible?" Like, the goal is reconciliation and family. The goal isn't it's our time to win. The goal is justice, which is what love looks like in public, Cornel West. But to love your neighbors, you love yourself can just be said justice. And by the way, I know of no other justice that happens societally or socially. So biblical justice happens in society and it's social.
So this is one of the things I really want to affirm about what you've done in this book and what you've done in your community is I know other leaders who get pieces of this. Like I know leaders, Christian leaders who are great on the social activism front. I know ones that are great on the theology and the preaching front or whatever. And what I love about what you've done is you've created a holistic and biblical model which says, listen, we need personal reconciliation. We need to be transformed by the gospel individually. We need communion with God and healing in our personal relationships. And that should then manifest itself in a community of reconciliation, a church that cares about these things and welcomes everyone in and is multi-ethnic. And that, as you say, go from the seats to the streets, then that has to manifest itself in our
Yes.
workplaces and the way we vote and our civic engagement and our schools. And you have this seamless cloth of justice from justice between me and God, justice between my intimate relationships, justice in my church community, and justice in my public action. And
Mhm.
that is just rare. And so I want to affirm that. I want to encourage folks to get this book if they're wanting to cultivate that kind of vision in their own life. Okay, before we go, again, another practical piece that you address in the book that I don't think gets enough attention when we do these things in the church. You talk about why mourning is so important and
Mhm.
so unpopular in the American church. Unpack that and describe what you mean by mourning, how you've done that at
Yeah.
Transformation Church, and why we can't skip that part of the process.
Yeah, yeah. First of all, as Americans, we're too productive to sit back and to look at what happened and reflect because we have to accomplish things. Now, historically, the Black church has been great at mourning or lament. The evangelical church, which the Black church is a part of, uh, not so much. And so mourning is deeply biblical, it's deeply beautiful. And I'll just go to the New Testament. Jesus says in Matthew 5:4, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. The word blessed, makros, in Greek literally means happy. Happy are those who mourn. Happy are those who are sad because they will be comforted. Mourning is our collective attention to look at the pain, suffering, and injustice, right? We don't take time to really do that because the devil will make white people feel guilty. It'll make them feel a certain way. And it's like, no, no, no. We need to look back at our past so we don't repeat it. We need to look back at our past and pray because out of pain comes purpose. Let me give you an example of some lamenting or mourning that we've recently done at Transformation Church. As Russia invaded Ukraine, uh, unjustifiably, and you see just this incredible wreckage and carnage and heartache, our church immediately said, hey, we're going to partner with Zoe churches in Poland that Nick and Chris Kane helped to plant. Refugees are coming from Ukraine to Poland. We want to minister to them. We want to help financially. We want to clothe and feed. And so we immediately said we were going to do that. And our auditorium just exploded with applause. And then I said, I want you to pause though. Do you remember the refugees from Syria? Russia did the
Mm-hmm.
same exact thing. I said, we gave money to support them. Do you know the refugees at our southern border in the United States of America from South America? They may not have a Putin, but they have drug lords and they're seeking asylum. And I said, I don't know if you noticed, but the picture of the European crisis with Ukrainians becoming refugees is like, oh my gosh, this is happening in Europe. We can't believe it. And it's so civilized. And I paused and I said, please remember this. World War One and World War II was not started in Syria or Latin America, started in Europe. Europe has a long history of barbarism and evil and atrocities. So let's make sure we don't have unconscious bias in how we view refugees, whether you from Ukraine, whether you from Syria, whether you from South America, whether you from Haiti, you are made in the image of God and you are worthy of respect and dignity and honor. And we're not going to politicize image bearers. We're going to gospelize them and reach them and love them. And I could see light bulbs in people's eyes,
Yeah.
just like, I never thought of it that way. So mourning collectively creates unity and then it creates synergy to move forward.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. I've been talking about that with my brother, and Phil and I have talked about this on the show. It's if you recall, when there was the refugee crisis on the southern border, like you said, people fleeing from the gangs and drug lords in Central and South America, and then when there was the Syrian refugee crisis, there was an immediate political response from particularly more conservative end of the spectrum, saying we need to stop taking refugees, we need to change our immigration laws, we need to, and it's been remarkable that I haven't heard any of that in the
Yep.
wake of the refugee crisis in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sad, but it's true. But that's a reminder we can't allow the political rhetoric to set the temperature. We have to
Right.
allow the gospel to set the temperature and dictate that. You make a really great case that mourning together for sins that we ourselves or evils we ourselves did not participate in or are guilty for, that process of mourning for those things builds empathy for
Yes.
those who are affected. And I wonder
Mm-hmm.
if I've been looking for practical things and practices that the church can do, especially in majority culture churches, to build that. And I think that might be the missing piece. Like I can lecture to somebody all day long about why, as say a white person in suburban America, they should care about these different historic injustices or reparations or whatever it might be, but it's hard to get them to feel it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where I think the mourning and the lamenting, and here we are in the season of Lent where we're supposed to be doing that collectively. We just don't have a theology for that in a lot of evangelicalism.
So, what I would say, Sky, is the Black church has for sure. I would say within white evangelicalism, it's been missing because there haven't been a whole bunch culturally to mourn because your position and posture has been normalized. But we miss out and we have to stop seeing ourselves through the lenses of our ethnic group and start seeing ourselves in the lenses of being the body of Christ, this beautiful, diverse, multi-ethnic, socioeconomically male, female bride. And that First Corinthians, I believe, 12:25, that if one part of the body hurts, we all hurt. But the sad thing is an individualized gospel built upon the four spiritual laws doesn't have room for the other because it's all about you and your personal relationship. Yes, God wants to relate with us. It's called a new covenant. We are in a covenant not only with the Lord, but with our brothers and sisters. Like we are our brothers and sisters' keeper. And so we don't have a theology of mourning because it's about my personal relationship with Jesus versus, man, I have brothers and sisters literally who have a different story and a different history. How can I learn those stories? How can I learn those histories? Can you imagine going to the doctor and you have something wrong with your lungs? And the doctor says, well, do you smoke? And you go, well, my past doesn't matter. Well, the doctor would go like, no, I'm trying to get a diagnosis of how you got in my seat and your lungs are not right. Well, what American Christians do, majority culture Christians do, is, well, we don't want to talk about the past. Well, if you don't talk about the past, you'll never know the present. And here's something that I'm learning the older I get. The past is never the past. It lingers in the present.
Yep. And there's a lot of biblical wisdom about that. Yeah. Derwin, the bromance continues, man. This is exactly why I love talking to you. You are just, you are a rare combination of theological insight, pastoral wisdom, and prophetic calling. I mean, it's all, I mean, you are sort of a walking contradiction to what you just said, like the body of Christ and the diversity of gifts, and we need one another. You got the whole package. I know that's not true, but
thank you.
It feels that way.
Thank you, Scott. I really respect your ministry, respect you, excited for you to come and preach at Transformation Church. Love the Holy Post podcast. And brother, I just, number one is I love Jesus. Like, he's been so good to me. And I want others to love him. And I want us to love the things that he loves. And he loves reconciliation. Jesus loves for his people to love. And so I've tried to create a resource that will give us new theological imagination and practical tools to actually live out this incredible love story.
Amen. Yeah. So everyone listening, pick up Derwin's new book, How to Heal Our Racial Divide. Derwin, thank you for coming back. I know you'll be back again. I look forward to it. And I pray that this book engages a lot of churches, a lot of Christian leaders, and a lot of Christians who need to be mobilized in a way they haven't before. Thanks so much.
Thank you, brother.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.